Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. Before I introduce our next episode of the Authority File, I want to remind our listeners that we have a brand new podcast on the way. It's called Patron Driven, and it's a narrative-style podcast that brings you crowdsourced library stories where the personal meets the professional. Season 1 is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey, and the 2 years it took to rebuild. It's a really incredible story and features writing and producing from the whole podcast team here at Choice, including Mark Dirks, Sabrina Kofer, and myself. I hope you'll tune in. Patron Driven debuts in late June wherever you get your podcast. You can visit our website, choice360.org, and click on the librarianship drop-down to sign up for email updates about Patron Driven. While you're there, you'll find behind-the-scenes bonus content for the new program, and you can check out the new trailer for the upcoming series. Okay, so in the meantime, in the next episode of this podcast, we're going to be talking about a new book published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. It's called The Black Prairie Archives, and it's a remarkable volume that collects a variety of works from a wide range of individuals, from 19th century black fur traders to contemporary writers and rappers. The volume sets out to redefine and expand the regional literature of the Canadian Prairie, highlighting the cultural output of late 19th and early 20th century black writers and residents of the Prairie, while finding a through line to today's black writers living in these same areas. The book is ambitious in its goal of transforming the traditional literary perspectives of the Prairie, male, Anglophone, and white, to one that is culturally more accurate. My guest is Karina Vernon, the editor of the Black Prairie Archives, and an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she focuses on teaching and research on Black Canadian literature, archives, and decolonization. This series is brought to you by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this second episode, Karina discusses what she discovered as she searched various archives for the works that are represented in her volume and how her book fits into the current cultural moment. You know, speaking of your collection, I'm wondering if you can kind of just characterize the volume for us and describe sort of the, in general terms, just sort of the range of materials and stories and voices that are represented in it.
In the introduction to the volume, I reconstruct the history of the prairies, the different waves of migration that have given rise to the Black culture on the prairies. And I say that there are sort of 4 waves, so to speak, of migration. And the archive bears the shape of those waves. So I begin with an acknowledgement of what I call the repertoire, the material that is primarily oral, that was produced, the oral cultures that were produced on the prairies before 1900. So I try to acknowledge the kind of cultural production that may have happened there, though it never entered the textual record. The songs, the gospels, the shouts, the stories, the recitations, the prayers, those kinds of things that don't register at the level of the archive. And so I have 1 page in the book that's all black with the title The Repertoire on it to kind of like acknowledge that the kind of material that can't enter the textual archive. And then from there, the archive is organized chronologically, beginning with material beginning with the earliest textual material that goes back to 1872, and then including the big wave of material that constellates around the Oklahoma migration of between, as I said, 1910, 1912. Then the material that was produced by the third wave of arrivants, people who came when the barriers to migration were lifted. The Prairie saw a big influx of people from other parts of Canada, but also from the US and the Caribbean and Africa. And then the archive moves into the contemporary moment. So there's a huge range of materials from oral histories, memoirs, letters, political speeches, um, essays, plays. In the contemporary period, there's rap, slam. Um, what else? I think I think I've about covered it.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So I'm wondering, you mentioned that the volume goes all the way up into into contemporary writings and stories, and I'm wondering how you think now that it's out that the Black Prairie Archive fits into the current cultural moment, whether in Canada or even internationally.
That's a great question. So, in Canada and in North America more broadly now, we're grappling in a number of ways with the pervasive anti Blackness of a lot of our social and cultural institutions,
Hmm.
whether that's in policing and over policing Black communities, in education, in the social welfare system, when it comes to education and curriculum. And these have given rise to movements that span the border. In the US and Canada, the Black Lives Matter movement. Um, in the field of Canadian literature specifically, it means that we're looking carefully at the stories we tell of Canada and its literature. And we're asking in what ways our literary canons have excluded Black authors and the representation of Black life. So, one of the goals of the anthology is to offer representations of Black life that we have not seen.
Hmm.
In Canada, we rarely think about rural experiences. When we think about the pioneers, when we think about sort of the first inhabitants of Indigenous land, usually we think of those people as Euro Canadian. And I wanted to offer other representations of Black life.
Hmm.
We're also, especially, I don't know if it's this way in the US as well, but in Canada, we're in an important moment of Indigenous cultural and political resurgence and sovereignty movements. So it was really important to me to attend to this as I was recovering the archive. I didn't want to think about the Black Prairies in a way that overwrote the primacy of Indigenous relationship to land. And I didn't want to reproduce the colonial understandings of that region. I wanted to think of Black stories, Black literature, and Black life in a way that also made space for Indigenous stories and histories, and to also see if I could look at the way that the stories are entangled, Black and Indigenous together on the prairies.
Right. I thought that was very interesting. I think you made a point of selecting stories and writers who, in the storytelling that they do, they're very aware of sort of their participation in indigenous societies, and there's just sort of an awareness in their writing about that and how they fit into that, um, and sort of contribute to um, sort of that you know blending within the indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm. It's a really
Um,
complicated story to tell.
yeah,
I found it's
exactly.
it's it's a hard one to grapple with.
Hmm.
When you see Black folks, as the first settlers on Indigenous land, you know, people who, this wave of settlers who came and were part of the displacement of Indigenous people.
Hmm.
But Black people were also seeking their own freedom in the only way that they could in their own political moment.
Right.
So my question was, how do you tell those stories together,
Hmm.
and how do we link um, anti-colonial struggles when the story is so complicated? So
Yeah.
I hope that I recover the Black Prairie Archive in a way that does not overwrite the important stories, Indigenous stories as well.
Exactly. So I think that just by what we've discussed so far, I mean, my next question, what scholarly and pedagogical possibilities do you envision this book opening up? I mean, already I think we've touched on a couple of enormous opportunities, but I'm wondering what other opportunities you think are available now.
I'm very curious about this too. I'm really curious to see how the volume will be used. I'm hoping it can enter classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to have a companion volume that's a more scholarly engagement with the archive, but I decided to publish them separately so that this volume could perhaps enter classrooms in a way that a scholarly monograph might not do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hoping that it will find its way into Canadian literature classrooms, Canadian history classrooms, classrooms that are focused on thinking about Black diasporas, Black Atlantic cultures. I had one very heartening email from a teacher in British Columbia who told me about the way that she was beginning to use the materials in her classroom. It made me feel very, very good. She said she was choosing selections from the volume and teaching them with contemporary Black philosophical thought. She was making selections. She particularly chose a piece of writing by E.A. Cobbs, who was writing on the prairies in the 1920s, and teaching that along with Desmond Cole's The Skin We're In. And I just thought, that's amazing to think about the various ways the individual chapters of this book might be paired with other historical or contemporary authors.
Mm-hmm. You just heard from Karina Vernon, the editor of the Black Prairie Archives and an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she focuses on teaching and research on Black Canadian literature, archives, and decolonization. This series is brought to you by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about what the book means to Karina on a more personal level, as well as more about how she conducted her archival research and the serendipitous discoveries she encountered along the way.
The book is scholarly, but it's also rooted in a deeply personal search for my own history and culture and identity. My family, my mother and father and I, as I mentioned, my family immigrated to the prairies in 1981 from Honduras. And so we became part of the story of the Black Prairies, but we didn't know it. When I arrived, I lived in a very small town called Olds, north of Calgary, an hour north of Calgary in Alberta. And at that time, I thought that my sister and I and our father were the only Black people to live on the prairies. And that was so deeply incorrect.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.